Mannen som dere skal få møte nå, han blir introdusert på sitt firmas hjemmeside som en akademiker i stadig bedring. A recovering academic. Det står også at han har en sterk lidenskap for kreativitet og teknologi. Stadig ifølge hjemmesida så er det sånn at når han ikke holder på med det, så sover han. Så her er det liksom bare enten eller. Kreativitet, det har Andyburnett gjort ikke bare til en lidenskap, men til en levevei. I samarbeid med blant annet de britiske forskningsrådene så har han utviklet en kreativ modell som han skal fortelle om her i dag, sandpit-modellen. Og da snakker vi om ganske mange, ja, om ikke lysår, så er det i alle fall en radikalt annerledes utvelgelses- og søknadsmetode enn det som vi kjenner her på berget. Andy Burnett, han kunne ikke ta turen hit i dag, men han lar seg selvfølgelig ikke stoppe av et Atlanterhav. Så han er innovativt, digitalt og kreativt svært til stede, direkte fra Buffalo på Skype. Please welcome Andy Burnett.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, I'm now being broadcast through the hotel sound system, and I'm going to talk as if I were. So, I'd like to start off by thanking one of your participants, Dr. Bai, I think it is, as Planet Bai. I'd like to thank you very much for tweeting in English because it enabled me to get at least some of Matt's jokes several minutes after the rest of you laughed, but at least I got the basic idea. What I would like to do for the next 20 minutes is to see if I can build on some of the topics that you've been discussing earlier on today, and to look specifically at one approach to bringing a more creative and multidisciplinary perspective to the generation of novel science. Obviously, it is just one approach, and I'm going to try and highlight what we have found works and pitfalls that we've come across. I've tried to keep my slides terribly simple because I understand that this conference is being streamed, and sometimes it's difficult to read the slides on that. So if anyone can't read them, the organizers have a copy of my slides. And also the slides themselves have some links to some resources on it. When I've finished here, I'll also tweet them under the hashtag, I'll just say hashtag knowledge, because I've tried several times to say it in Norwegian and my friends just laugh. So I'm also very happy to take questions afterwards by email. It just seems to stretch the technology a little bit too far to try and do it in real time, but do please get in touch with me. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk a little bit about the history of sand pits. Now, what I'm going to describe are known as sand pits in most parts of the world. In the United States, they're called ideas labs because there is a slightly different meaning of sand pits, and I only mention that in case you're looking in the literature and you find these two references. Basically, it's the same thing. So I want to talk about what they are, how they came to be, what it looks like in practice, and what we've learned over 10 years of running them. And then finally, to talk a little bit about where we hope to take them in the future, because there are all sorts of fascinating things that are happening in the world of collaborative and multidisciplinary science. And it really gives us astonishing possibilities. So to start with, just looking at the history of this, if you cast your mind back to 2003, at that time, an organization called EPSRC, many of you might be familiar with it, but it stands for the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and it is one of the funding councils in the UK. And this body realized that they had a problem with the funding proposals that they were receiving from their communities. And as one might imagine, their communities are the maths, chemistry, physics, engineering disciplines. Now, I'm going to, at this point, hope that if I say next slide, please, somebody somewhere will click the next slide. And it should now on your screen say what was the problem. So in very simple terms, the problem that EPSRC were experiencing, or the problems, were that the proposals they were receiving were predominantly monodisciplinary. And in addition to that, the nature of the proposals they felt were fundamentally incremental rather than transformational. Now, at this point, I'd just like to emphasize, I think there is still, as does the EPSRC, think there is huge value in monodisciplinary incremental research. There are still massive areas of knowledge which it is appropriate to explore in that manner. However, the Funding Council were concerned that they weren't receiving enough radical proposals, and they may even think of it as dangerous and risky proposals. And so they wanted to see if they could find a way to address this. And when they went out to their communities and said, why don't you bring us more radical proposals, the communities pretty much universally said, because when we do, the peer review process shoots them down. And this is not a fundamental problem that's unique to the UK. We work with academic organizations all around the world, and this is generally the case. You could think of it as almost regression to the mean. There's also some good research on the fact that people rate their own research as much more innovative than they rate the research of others, and therefore peer review has an inherent bias against radical research. Related to this was the recognition that an increasing proportion of the interesting scientific discoveries were happening at the intersection of disciplines. And of course, the problem with that is that the intersection can be a messy place. People don't necessarily speak the same language, they don't bring the same set of assumptions, and so it tended to be easier to stay away from the intersections. Now, in an attempt to address this, and what I still regard as really quite a brave step, EPSRC came up with the idea of a sandpit, and I'll explain what it involves in a moment. But basically, what a lady called Susan Morell, who is still at the agency, developed was the idea of holding a very intensive workshop which had funding directly associated with it, and in the course of a week, people would go from not knowing each other or necessarily the problem through to having developed interesting and risky research proposals which they would get a funding decision on there and then. So clearly a very different process from the way most funding councils typically work. If we go to the next slide, I'll just try and tell us a little bit more about how it works. So sandpits, as they were originally conceived, were focused upon difficult and messy problems. Climate change would be a nice example where one could view it from many different perspectives. And I'll show you a few more examples. And there's also a link in the slide pack to all of the sandpits that EPSRC have run. We've now run a different set for different agencies around the world. And you'll see that there's a link at the end of our slide pack to our blog, which, if you are interested in this at all, we've tried to write up a reasonable amount about the process. So you start off with a difficult and messy problem, and typically we see those problems fall into two categories. One category we regard as stakeholder driven, and this would be where you have a problem which the discipline or collection of disciplines have not made a lot of progress on for a period of time, and there are people who can quite clearly describe what the problem is and why they're fed up about it. So, for instance,